So now as we move into the Iron Age, we're going to start talking about a very important group of people, often called the Israelites, the Hebrews. Their descendants, or a group of them later on, will be known as the Judeans or the Jews. And these folks are going to be crucial for understanding the development of Western religion, of Middle Eastern religion in the long term. Now, the first mention that we actually have of the Israelites in the archaeological record is the Merneptah stele from 1207-ish BCE. And around the exact same time that we have that stele, we also have the development of new architectural styles in the highlands of southern Canaan, over there in the Levant. When I say highlands, I'm not talking about crazy tall mountains, but I'm talking about a hillier country, a higher country. The pottery of the people living in these highlands is essentially the same as the pottery used in the rest of Canaan. It is clearly Canaanites that have moved into this region, but they are starting to develop their own style. One of the clear differences is in how they're starting to build their houses. For most of their houses, a central courtyard was added, so an empty space in the middle of the house that had a fire pit, and the lower level was where livestock was kept, with people living on the second level of these homes. It wasn't radically different from what we saw in the rest of Canaan, but clear differences from what we see in the north and near the coast. This new group is what's going to become the Israelites. And like I said, they are essentially Canaanites with slight tweaks. One of the clear clues that they're Canaanites is that they are building the exact same types of shrines as the Canaanites. Up in what's often called the high places, or on the tops of hills, is where shrines were built. And on these shrines, we often see depictions of the bull, probably of El. Certainly a very similar bull as we see to shrines to the Canaanite god El. You might remember that El in the Canaanite language just means God, but that El was also an important god himself, the father of the gods, the king of the gods. So even though we start getting this Israelite culture in the late 13th century BCE, it's not until around the 9th or 8th centuries BCE that they start actually writing down their histories. Which of course means that we have a lot of folk history that's being put into play, and these histories are being written by scribes, usually working either for the royal court or for priests. And so these scribes also are having to contend with court intrigue and with different types of personalities that are all vying for power within these small Israelite kingdoms of the 9th and 8th century. These histories, or at least the histories that are eventually come to be known as scripture, are going to be written all the way up probably until the 1st century BCE, definitely up until the 3rd century BCE. And this is what we're going to cover first in the more mythological history of the Israelites, the stories they told of themselves going back hundreds of years before they actually started writing down their histories or writing down this scripture. And of course, eventually, those histories are going to start to line up with more corroborated sources as they're written more contemporaneously. Now, eventually, all of these different writings are going to be collected into an anthology. Christians know this anthology as the Old Testament, or this collection of books as the Old Testament. Sometimes it's called the Hebrew Bible, but it's often called by Jewish people the Tanakh. Now, this name, the Tanakh, comes from 3 traditional divisions of the collection. First, we have the Torah, which translates as the teaching or the law, are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Next up are the Nevi'im, or the prophets. These are divided into 2 different groups. We have the former prophets. These are the stories of the Israelites before they end up getting exiled to Babylon in the 6th century BCE. And these books include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And the latter prophets. These are books that take place either during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century or afterwards. These include the books of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then what's often called the 12 minor prophets. And finally, we have the Ketuvim, or the writings. Now, these include things like the Psalms, which are songs that are meant to be sung to God, Proverbs, little bits of advice. The book of Job, which you might have heard about, which is about a man who is totally dedicated to God. But Satan convinces God to make Job prove it, which essentially means God lets Satan torture Job, lets him kill his whole family. Job stays loyal, so God gives him back a bunch of his wealth and gives him a new family. It's a book about obedience even when you don't know why you're being punished. Also part of the Ketuvim are the 5 scrolls. These are 5 kind of celebratory books that are often used during Jewish prayers or Jewish festivals. These are the Song of Songs, a very naughty book, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Then there is a book of prophecy. This is the book of Daniel. This is when we get into what's often called apocalyptic prophecy. It's really a book about the coming end of the world before God remakes Jerusalem kind of above everything else. And then the whole thing wraps up with a couple more history books, Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the book of Chronicles. These 2 books kind of recap the whole history of the Bible. They tell it slightly differently with different details, and some of them conflict, but the idea is to kind of put it all together. Kind of the Cliff Notes of the Hebrew Bible. So this first book, Genesis, goes back to the mythical beginning of the world. So in the Hebrew book of Genesis, there's actually 2 creation stories. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 give 2 different accountings of how the world was created. They're similar, but things happen in different order. And in both of these stories, God is either referred to as Yahweh or Elohim. And according to tradition, the beginning of the world happened in the year 3761 BCE. The first humans were created and placed into a special garden, a perfect place, the Garden of Eden. And according to Genesis, this was built somewhere east of Jerusalem. You might remember that Eridu often being referred to as this perfect garden place in ancient Mesopotamian lore. When the humans were placed in this garden, they were given names. The man was called Adam, or the Adam. That just means the human, or the man. The woman is named Eve, which means source of life. They were put in charge of all living things. Now, they were allowed to eat almost any plant they want, but no animals. In the perfect world that God created in Eden, humans were vegetarian. But there was one plant they weren't allowed to eat from. That was the plant, or that was the fruit that came from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is actually an old Egyptian idea. The Egyptian term for everything was evil, good. And when we say evil, don't think like cosmic forces of evil, like good versus evil. Evil is things that hurt, things that create discomfort, things that take us out of our natural state. But if you think of the whole spectrum of reality, it goes from good to evil. It goes from things that bring us joy, things that bring us comfort, to things that bring us pain. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil likely meant the knowledge or the self-awareness of the world. Again, we need to pull ourselves back a little bit into how old Mesopotamian mythology worked. You might remember Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh having to deal with a new man, Enkidu, who became his friend eventually. But Enkidu, you might remember, was not self-aware. He was part of the animal world until he slept with the priestess and then became aware that he was different from all the animals around him, that he was something separate, that he was a human, which was in some ways above, or at least separate from the rest of nature. Well, according to Genesis, Eve is the one who decided to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She was tricked into it by a serpent. And to be clear, when this story was written, there was no knowledge of Satan. That was not part of the Hebrew lexicon. A serpent. The idea that the serpent was Satan is later Christian lore. We'll get to that. And after Eve ate the fruit and became self-aware, she convinced Adam, or Adam, to do the same. Adam becomes self-aware, and the first thing they realize is that they're naked. Again, this sounds a whole lot like Enkidu. So they sewed together some fig leaves. They essentially made themselves some clothing, again, out of plants, not out of animal skins. But because they did this, Yahweh was able to figure out, why are you guys wearing clothes? How would you know that you were naked unless you ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Then there's mentioned in the story that there is another tree, the tree of life, and Yahweh worries that if the humans now figure out to eat from the tree of life, not only will they be self-aware, but they will also become immortal, that they will become just like God. And so in order to prevent that, God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden, and he condemns them to a life of difficulty. Women will now have to bear children in a painful way, obviously often a deadly way, particularly in the ancient world. Men are going to have to toil, they're going to have to work in order to grow food. It's not going to just be growing abundantly everywhere around them. And women are now condemned to always be underneath their husbands' or their father's thumbs, that they must be controlled by men according to Yahweh. So over the next 1600 years, humans continue to multiply as God had commanded. There are more and more of them. During this time, supposedly, they had huge lifespans. Adam lived to be 930 years old, according to Genesis. And this is pretty common in ancient mythology, the idea that in a previous epoch, in a previous time, humans had very long lifespans. It's worth noting that the longest living human was a man named Methuselah. He was the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Adam, and he lived until 969 years old, according to Genesis. Now, eventually, over the course of these generations, Yahweh eventually regrets making human beings. He feels they become too evil, that they become too hurtful to the world, and he decides that he needs to kill them all. Except one. A man named Noah, Adam's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. Now, to be clear on these dates, these are all kind of estimations. There are different types of calculations that people have done to try to figure out around when the dates are in the Bible, but these are kind of standard dates. Around the year 2100 BCE, Yahweh decided that it was time to wipe out all of humanity except for Noah and his family, including his 3 sons, their wives, Noah's wife, and of course, the rest of the animal life on the planet. So around the year 2100 BCE, Yahweh commanded Noah to build an ark, a really big boat, with the idea that he would load up a bunch of animals on there. You've probably heard that Noah was supposed to take 2 of every kind, though there again are different versions in the Bible, because the Bible is kind of a mashup of different writings. And in the book of Genesis, in one part of it, he's supposed to take 7 pairs of clean animals. In others, he just takes 1 pair of each type of animal. Afterwards, he makes a sacrifice to God, and Noah and his 3 sons go on to repopulate the entire earth over time. Again, if you remember the Gilgamesh flood story, or the Atrahasis flood story, all of this should be sounding kind of familiar. So about 350 years after that, around the year 1750 BCE, there was a man named Terah, a descendant of Shem, one of Noah's sons, living in the city of Ur. Man, the city of Ur is a famous city in the ancient world. In any case, Terah, who might have been a Mesopotamian priest, later legends will say that he was, brought his family with him, including his 70-year-old son, a man named Abram. Incidentally, the word Abram just means exalted father. The Akkadian word for father was actually Abu or Abam or Abam, very close to Abram. Terah, when he was taking his family out of Ur, the original plan was actually to resettle in Canaan, but Terah decided to stay in the town of Haran. This is way up in southeastern Anatolia. About 5 years later, hanging out in the city of Haran, Yahweh approaches Abram. He said that if Abram left his family, or at least his father, and went to Canaan, he would make Abram's descendants into a quote-unquote great nation. Abram took his wife, who was also his half-sister, a woman named Sarai, with him. Now remember, Egyptians had an old tradition of incestual demigod kings and queens, and one of the things to keep in mind is that even though the Israelites themselves are Semitic people, very closely related to the Akkadian folk, to the Babylonians, they lived in an area that had long been dominated by Egypt. So you kind of get a blending of these two different types of mythologies within the Israelite mythology. Along with his wife/half-sister Sarai, he took his nephew Lot. And they did briefly settle in Canaan, but there was a famine in Canaan. By the way, this was a common occurrence in the Bronze Age, and a lot of people who lived in Canaan in the Bronze Age, when there was drought and famine, they would move to Egypt, because remember, Egypt had the Nile, which meant that it had consistent food production. And Abram and his family did the exact same thing. He took his family to Egypt. While in Egypt, Abram worried that his wife, Sarai, was just a little too hot, a little too sexy, and he was worried that Pharaoh would kill him in order to claim her for himself. So instead, Abram said that she was just his sister. Pharaoh married her and traded heavily with Abram, which made Abram rich. When the Pharaoh found out that they were really married, the Pharaoh was kind of upset, and he kicked both of them out of Egypt, sending them back to Canaan. Abram resettled in Canaan with Sarai and with his nephew Lot, but now he actually had large herds and gold and silver. Remember, he made a lot of money underneath the Pharaoh, and he's able to hire hundreds of servants, including a small army. Yahweh again visited Abram and made a covenant. Covenant is just a sacred agreement. He still said Abram and Sarai are going to have kids, which seemed quite silly. They were getting incredibly old at this point. They still didn't actually have any kids. Yahweh promised that they were coming. He said that Abram's descendants would get all the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. This is a little confusing because what's often referred to as the Jewish promised land or the Israelite promised land really is just in Canaan. But here, God seems to be implying that he's going to get stuff in Egypt going all the way up to northern Mesopotamia. Don't get too bogged down in those details, though. And indeed, this land is going to be known as the Promised Land. That is, the land that is promised to Abram and his descendants. When he was 86, and still without kids, Sarai said he should have sex with her slave, a woman named Hagar. And with Hagar, he had a child named Ishmael. Ishmael just means God hears. When he was 100, Yahweh again visited Abram. He said that children were coming with Sarai. Again, this was getting really ridiculous. Sarai is probably in her 90s at this point. He promised to make Abram father of many nations, not just one great one. And he renamed him Abraham, which according to Genesis means father of multitudes. And he renamed Sarai Sarah. No reason was given for this name change. In order to solidify this covenant, he required that Abraham circumcise himself. That is, cut off the foreskin of his penis. And it should be noted, this was actually, again, an Egyptian practice. Egyptian priests usually were required to circumcise themselves before, or be circumcised, before they could work in Egyptian temples. It was a sign of cleanliness. Same reason why Egyptian priests had to shave all their hair off. Yahweh also required that Abraham circumcise all the men of his household, including Ishmael and all of his servants and all of his slaves. Circumcision became the primary sign of a covenant between Yahweh and Abraham's descendants, which is why it is still one of the important rituals of modern-day Judaism. Now, it should be noted that Abraham is the first person in the Hebrew Bible to actually be called a Hebrew, Abraham the Hebrew. We're not totally sure where this word comes from. It's not a common term that the Israelites used to refer to themselves. It's certainly the name of the language that they used, though it sounds a whole lot like the word Habaru or Haparu, which were those mountain folk who lived in Canaan that had been acting as essentially robbers during the late Bronze Age. Seems like there's a connection there. Now, when he was 100 years old, Abraham and Sarah finally did have a kid of their own, whom he named Isaac. Abraham is often seen as the first patriarch of the Israelites or of the Judean people. Isaac is seen as the second patriarch or great father. Well, about 3 years after the birth of Isaac, Sarah got kind of jealous of the fact that Abraham already had a kid with her slave Hagar, and she demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. According to Genesis, Yahweh made sure that Hagar and Ishmael actually had a decent life. And it needs to be noted, because we are going to eventually be talking about the rise of Islam. Arabs, or at least Islamic Arabs, will later claim that they are the descendants of Ishmael. So that the Jewish people are descendants of Isaac, the Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael, but they would claim they're all descendants of Abraham. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Sometime during Isaac's childhood, maybe around the age of 12, it's not clear, God decides to test Abraham. And he commanded that Abraham bring Isaac up to one of these high places, one of these hilltop altars, in order to sacrifice him to Yahweh. At the very last second, God stops him and provided him with a wild ram to be sacrificed to God instead. It should be noted that a lot of Canaanite cultures did practice child sacrifice. This seems to be a story saying, like, that might be what the old folks did. We don't do that anymore. It seems to be a change within the Israelite culture, and explaining why they don't do child sacrifice, though their near cousins to the north still were carrying it out. So Isaac gets to live, and when he was 40, he married a woman from northern Mesopotamia, a woman named Rebekah. It also took these two a long time to have kids, but after 20 years, Rebekah gave birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. So Esau had come first and was supposed to inherit most of Isaac's property. This is the norm in most cultures, or at least most ancient cultures, that the oldest son is going to get the bulk of the inheritance. But Yahweh, while Rebekah was pregnant, had given a prophecy to her saying, quote, "The elder shall serve the younger." For her, she had always known that God had chosen Jacob over Esau. And Esau, by the way, was, in these stories, a hunter, a herdsman. He was somebody who worked with animals, which meant that he was able to kill animals for meat, to feed his family, to feed his friends, to sacrifice to God. Jacob was a simple farmer. So Jacob, didn't have the luxuriant types of things like meat to serve. But there is a story of how Esau was starving after a failed hunt, and Jacob offered him bread and lentil stew in exchange for Esau's birthright. In other words, he said, "I'll let you live, I'll feed you while you're starving, but you got to give me all of Dad's stuff when he dies. I'm going to be the one that inherits everything from Isaac." And when Isaac was old, Rebekah helped Jacob trick his dad. Isaac was blind. Jacob pretended to be Esau. Esau was really hairy, and so Jacob put on animal clothes that made him seem like Esau to his blind dad. And Isaac blessed Jacob as his heir, just as God always wanted. It's never explained why God wanted Jacob to get this blessing, and it's not explained why trickery was necessary in order to do it, but this was seen as the fulfillment of God's plan, or of Yahweh's plan. So by the time we get to the early 16th century, 1590s, 1580s, somewhere in that region, BCE, Jacob marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel. There was a whole lead up to this. He had always wanted to marry Rachel. He worked for Rachel's father, but then was forced to marry Leah. Ultimately, it took him about 14 years of laboring for their father in order to be able to marry Rachel, but he had to take Leah as well. At this point in the story, he's thinking he's going to have to deal with his upset brother. Remember, he kind of tricked Esau into giving up his birthright, or at least he took advantage of Esau. And so he thinks, I'm going to have to deal with this. On his way to what he thinks is going to be a battle with Esau, he's randomly attacked by some guy on the road. This guy, he ends up wrestling with him all night. This dude eventually even knocks Jacob's hip out of his socket, but Jacob wouldn't give up. And in the morning, it turned out that this man he was wrestling with was either a messenger of God, later this will be referred to as an angel of God, or possibly God himself, because God renames him. God says, "You're no longer Jacob, you'll now be known as Israel." Israel means to struggle with El. Now, again, this is a linguistic issue. It really means to struggle with God, right? To struggle with Yahweh. But remember, that word El is a Canaanite word that just means God. After this, he continues on to have his battle with Esau, and it turns out Esau had no beef with him, really solidifying the idea that Jacob, or Israel, was the correct inheritor. He was supposed to be the third and final patriarch. Now, Israel had 12 sons with his 2 wives and his 2 concubines. These sons were said to be the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And it should be noted, this type of story is a common one in the ancient world to describe how slightly different groups are actually part of a unified whole. The Greeks had similar stories, believing that the Achaeans and the Ionians were descendants of brothers. Now, out of all of these sons, Jacob, or Israel, loved Joseph the best. He was the oldest son with his favorite wife, Rachel. So he gave him a multicolored coat, which made his brothers a little bit jealous. Joseph also told his brothers about dreams he had, where one day they would bow down to him. This was not helping matters, and eventually his brothers sold Joseph into slavery into Egypt. And then they told their father that Joseph was just dead. Now, after a period of slavery, Joseph actually ended up in prison in Egypt. And while there, some of the Pharaoh's officials were also sent to prison. While they were in prison, he successfully interpreted some of their dreams. And so when they got out and these officials got to work for the Pharaoh again, they told the Pharaoh about Joseph. And when the Pharaoh had dreams that his advisors couldn't interpret, Joseph was brought in order to divine the future from these dreams. Joseph reads essentially Pharaoh's dreams. He predicts that there's going to be 7 years of famine in Egypt, which meant the Egyptians need to save up grain to get through it. And when it turns out he's correct, Joseph is made the vizier of Egypt, essentially the prime minister for the Pharaoh. Not long after that, some of his brothers came to Egypt in order to trade for some food. And he teased them a bit. He screwed with them. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know he was vizier. They hadn't known his whole story. But when he reveals himself to them, and they're so distraught and they're so upset, he says to them that their cruelty was actually part of God's plan. You see a theme here. Even when things are going bad, this is actually part of God's plan. Even when people are acting poorly, they're doing so because it's part of God's plan. After all of this, he invited them to live out the rest of the famine in Canaan within Egypt. And so sometime in the mid to late 16th century BCE, 1550s, 1540s, somewhere in there, Israel and his sons moved to the land of Goshen. Goshen was a land or a city in Egypt, possibly even close to that city of Avaris, that city that the Hyksos had ruled from, that other Semitic-speaking group. Early in the 15th century BCE, Joseph dies. He's buried in Egyptian fashion with mummification and a coffin. And this is where the book of Genesis ends. The next book, Exodus, starts with things going bad. Israel's descendants, or Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, have a lot of offspring. And within a few decades after Joseph's death, Pharaoh starts to get freaked out about the numbers that they are. He just thinks there's too many of them in Egypt and they're becoming dangerous. And so he begins enslaving them. He even tries to get Egyptian midwives to kill newborn Hebrew boys, though that doesn't happen. This goes on for a few hundred years, and by the time we get to the 13th century BCE, Pharaoh again puts out a command that all Hebrew babies need to be thrown in the river when they're born. Now there's one Levite woman who's a descendant of Levi, who takes her newborn son and decides she's going to hide him in a basket. She takes that basket, she puts it in the rushes of the river, so near the bank of the river, where Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket, finds the baby, takes the baby, and names it Moses. This story, if you remember the birth story of Sargon, should sound familiar. And this is not to say that this is like an instance of plagiarism or something like that. This is to say that this is a story that anybody in the ancient world would recognize as a man being born, or a a man being born into greatness. This is how Sargon got his start. He wasn't supposed to be born. He's put in a basket. He's raised within the king's household. He grows up to become a great emperor. Moses is going to grow up to become the leader of the Israelites, to become the lawgiver to the Israelites. And this story is signifying, this is what happens, or this is how great men are born. In the modern day, we have similar tropes. If I was ever telling you a story of some miraculous way that somebody stopped somebody from getting hit by a car, and I said, I swear, man, I think I saw a cape on that guy's back, you would automatically be like, oh, superhero, Superman, something like that. And even if that was meant to be built up a little bit, I didn't actually see a cape, I was talking about. I was saying there was something special about this person. That's the same thing with this story. This story is a well-known story in the ancient world, and this is a way to signify that there was something special about Moses.